Well, howdy there, stranger. I'm Jordi.
And I'm Brad.
And welcome back to Beers with Queers, the true crime podcast where I research a case and Brad here, and potentially you guys,
Don't know a damn thing about it.
So this is the final episode of 2024. I apologize. If you listened to last week's episode, all throughout the episode, I kept saying this is our last episode of 2024 before the new year. And at the very, very end of it, I was informed that, in fact, we have one more week of 2024. So this is the last episode of Beers with Queers of 2024.
For real this time.
For real this time. You know, it is that sweet spot between Christmas and New Year's where time ceases to exist and it literally means nothing. I don't even know what day it is. So this week, we're going to be doing something a little different. This week, we're going to be talking about a long-forgotten tragedy that struck the queer community of New York during the 1970s at the height of the gay liberation movement. Less than a decade after the Stonewall Uprising, the queer community of New York was seeing an unprecedented level of freedom and rights as they were finally able to live more openly and free without having to hide who they were. But in the midst of the growing celebration of their freedoms, a senseless tragedy would cause the party to come crashing down in the worst way possible. This week, we're talking about the Everard Baths fire and the devastation that it left in its wake. So this episode will be more of a queer history episode as we discuss the history of not only the infamous Everard Baths and the rise and fall of gay baths in general, which although are still present here and there, like there are still bathhouses and gay bathhouses, I think mostly in Europe. Sadly, they do not hold as much cultural significance as they once did. This case will also be pretty similar to our coverage of the upstairs lounge fire, which we also covered in episode 34 or 35, I think. But it was also a horrific tragedy that left over 30 men dead at a gay bar in New Orleans and remains one of the darkest times in queer history here in America. So I think pretty much everyone has heard of the upstairs lounge fire, or at least it's more well known than the case we're covering today.
I had never heard about it until we covered it on the podcast.
That is true. Actually, I did have a few people when we did that episode mention, they were like, I didn't know about the gay bar fire. So it was, if you haven't listened to the episode, highly recommend it because it was a very senseless tragedy. It was intentional. 32 men lost their lives, and up until the Pulse shooting in 2016, it was the worst terrorist attack on the queer community up to that point in America. So I am happy that we brought some recognition to that case and the victims.
And if you go and look at the pictures and everything of the upstairs lounge fire, it really hits home.
It does, and some haunting photos. And then if you read the background of it, the reaction from the general public is horrific. But even still, I guess I say it's more well known because even with the upstairs lounge fire, I found more articles, there's books written about it, there's multiple podcasts that have covered it. But with the Everard Baths fire, not much out there. There's a few articles here and there. There's a few memorial pages here and there. But other than that, unless you are really looking for it, you won't come across it. So it has sadly started being forgotten by history with very little coverage on the incident. But the effects it had on the queer community of New York are immeasurable. So I'm happy that we are able to keep the memory of the victims alive and also the memory of the Everard, as at its prime was seen as one of the biggest and safest spaces for gay men everywhere. So let's jump right into it. It's the early morning hours of May 25th, 1977 in New York City, and in a discreet building located at 28 West 28th Street, at least 100 men roam the halls and the various rooms hidden inside. It's just before 7 a.m., and 18-year-old Miguel Augusto is preparing to turn in for the day after a long night of partying here at the Everard Baths. Now, not only does it function as a gay bathhouse for men to meet and have anonymous sex, it also acts as a dormitory, a place where men can rent enclosed cubicles to have a more intimate encounter, or even just to use it as a cheap motel. As Miguel prepares to wind down for the day, he is suddenly awoken by screams of panic coming from just outside his door. Opening the door, Miguel looked through the door into the room directly across the hall, and inside he saw two men wrestling with a mattress which had been engulfed in flames. Soon smoke began to billow out of the room and flooded the hallway as people began screaming, "Fire! Fire!" Down the hall, other voices began screaming for people to follow their voices to safety, as pretty soon dozens of men began to pour out into the hall in a panic and blinded by thick walls of smoke. Within seconds of entering the hall, the entire scene erupted into chaos as the halls filled with thick smoke, and then suddenly, the power throughout the whole building cut off and plunged everyone into darkness. As the panic set in, Miguel realized that it was going to be impossible for him to find his way to the nearest exit without succumbing to smoke inhalation first. Thinking fast, he thought of another idea. Down the hall in the opposite direction, where the bathrooms were, he hoped would have a potential exit, and so he made a dash for it. Once at the bathroom, Miguel realized that thankfully there was a window, but that was short-lived as he looked down to see it was a straight drop from the third floor to the Manhattan sidewalk below. But upon closer inspection, he realized that there was actually a bar sticking out past the window, and thinking fast, he grabbed on and began to swing himself back and forth while dangling 3 stories above the ground. Using all of his strength, he swung forward and flung himself onto the roof of the building next door. Now safe from the fire, Miguel could only watch helplessly as he saw the Everard Baths go up in flames and the screams of 100 men trapped inside echoed out into the city below. So that just shows you how quickly that scene escalates. This was in minutes, less than minutes, and the whole thing was already pure chaos. So before we go on, let's go back and look at the history of one of the most popular and famous meeting spots for gay men from around the world. And that's one thing I always love about covering cases like this too, is like the Everard Baths was an empire. It was one of the most well-known, iconic, infamous spaces to the queer community all around the world. And so it's always fascinating to me the fact that as time goes on, you know, these types of fallen empires are forgotten about and they no longer hold as much significance. So it's always fascinating to read about, gay spaces in their prime of yesteryear. So to do that, we have to go all the way back to 1860, when the space that would become a place for sexual encounters between homosexuals originally opened up and operated as a church.
Very interesting.
Love to see the irony here. The first Free Will Baptist Church operated for the next 5 years, as the area at the time was made up mainly of private homes and residential neighborhoods. However, as New York grew in popularity, the church would eventually abandon the location as residents of the area began to flee as theater and business chains moved closer and closer towards them.
Did you say flee?
Yes. So it's kind of like what they call white flight, which is when a lot of businesses they're moving closer and closer, buying up more property. And so now it's no longer a quiet residential neighborhood. You're right next door to downtown. So everyone's like, that's our cue to skedaddle. So during the 1870s, the space was home to a music hall and exhibition hall, which also hosted the Horticultural Society for a time, before on January 18th, 1888, newspapers announced that 28 West 28th Street had just been purchased by a man named James Everard, a millionaire businessman who specialized in beer brewing. James announced through the papers that he was planning to completely change the space and convert it into a Turkish-style bathhouse. So I think most of us have an idea of what we imagine a bathhouse is.
Well, honestly, when you were reading about the fire and everything, because at first I thought, man, a fire in a bathhouse It's kind of like the IT crowd where he's like, your family burned up in a fire at sea parks. Because I'm picturing water. I'm picturing like a Roman bathhouse with like these big pools and everything like that. But then the actual like pragmatic side of myself is like, no, this is not really about baths, and it's not really about these big pools and everything. It's about having a lot of little rooms and stuff like that to have sex in. So I'm toning the water back way, way in my mind at this point. And I'm picturing more of like, I don't know, like hallways with lots of doors on them, with like little places where you can go. So I could see where like you probably got like this one long hallway.
Mm-hmm.
And then when a fire gets into something like that, chaos. So I'm thinking, yeah, there's not as much water around, a fire definitely could get out into something like this.
Well, and as we'll see, it is a bathhouse, so your first reaction is like, bath, there's water. But as we'll see and come to know, the owners of the Everard were a little bit behind on the upkeep. So like I said, I think most of us have an idea of what a bathhouse is, especially here in America. I know they're more common in Europe, but during the 18 and early 1900s, bathhouses were literally just that, a place where you could go to take a bath. Because during this time, it was not a requirement for real estate in New York to come equipped with a bath or shower, and so this led to bathhouses becoming extremely popular. The Everard Baths opened to the public on May 3rd, 1888, and were described as being some of the most luxurious and high-tech bathhouses in the country, with James Everard sparing no expense. They were meant for upper middle class and higher class to come and experience a, quote, spa-like experience, which included lavish Victorian-style decorations, private dressing rooms, and even rooms to rent for traveling lodgers. The main room of the baths was equipped with a massive skylight, and directly below it was the main centerpiece, a 50-foot-long, 20 feet wide, 6-foot deep pool or bath that was filled with 65,000 gallons of artesian water and kept at a constant 60 degrees.
Still dirty water with that much people in it.
Especially back in 1890, they do not have the type of upkeep that would be needed to make that water swimmable or bathable. Now, moving beyond the Turkish baths was an area known as the Russian baths. And I didn't realize that until researching this case, that there are different types of baths. There's Russian baths, there's Turkish baths. I'm still not quite sure what's the difference between them, but if someone out there knows, please let us know. So the Russian baths was an area that was lined from ceiling to floor with white marble and featured a smaller 20,000-gallon pool that had dolphins made of marble spouting water into it.
So this place is fancy.
And that's how you know it is fancy. They have marble dolphins spitting the water into the pool. These rooms came equipped with water guns and steam cannons, which users could operate themselves to massage themselves with the pressurized water or to steam themselves. During this time of operation, only one known incident occurred on November 28, 1898, when a young soldier was found dead in a room he had rented for the night. An autopsy would later reveal a gas leak was his cause of death, and it didn't take long for the baths to return to operating as normal after that. James Everard would pass away in 1913, and following his death, his daughter, Olga Julia, would take over the business. Olga had big plans for the Everard, and in 1914 announced that the baths would now be exclusive to women. Most baths at this time, actually all baths at this time, were designed to be exclusively for men, because, women and men mingling in a bathhouse together was way too scandalous. Now, word of this new change spread quickly around the city, as it was described as the first of its kind and offered services ranging from hairdressing, manicures, and massages for women at any hour of the day or night, which, bring that back. I would love that. Olga even introduced a restaurant inside of the baths and kept the dorm-style rooms to rent to traveling women. Now, concept-wise, sounds really great, but despite the initial positive press surrounding the new change, it seemed to have failed rather quickly, as by 1916, the baths were once again back to being exclusive to men. Prices for a bath at the time ranged from 50 cents to $1.70, which today would equal How much do you think that would equal today? $1.70 in 1914 is the spending power of how much today?
Probably about $25.
That is equal to $72
Oh, wow.
in 2024.
That's expensive for a bath.
But that also includes like the manicures, the hairdressing, the massage, which...
Well, I mean, the men probably wouldn't be getting the manicures and the hairdressing.
But they would be getting the massages and stuff. So, and also I think you're paying for the exclusivity of it. Like they said, they meant it for middle and upper middle class men. So it's like, we will pay more just to keep the poor people out. By 1919, bathhouses were starting to fall out of fashion as new homes and apartments were built that now required cleaning facilities. And it seemed that bathhouses, including the Everard, were going to become extinct sooner rather than later. But surprisingly, the baths continued to remain popular with certain groups of men as more and more gay men began to frequent the establishment and used it as a private place to find other men to hook up with.
You didn't have to have a place to host that, especially if you had a wife and family at home.
You didn't, and the baths are exclusive, they're private, and obviously you can see, like, especially in the early 1900s, Grindr wasn't a thing, so this was perfect to meet other men. Now, there is no way to actually tell when gay men began to frequent the baths, most likely since it very first opened. But we do know that by the end of World War I, the Everard Baths was a very popular cruising spot for homosexuals in New York, which also tracks, as we've stated multiple times on this podcast. Fun fact, one of the unintended consequences of World War I and World War II was the thousands of gay men whom were discharged and dropped off in the nearest port city, which was usually New York or San Francisco. And from there, they were able to start forming their own queer communities. We do know that on January 15th, 1919, the baths were raided by the New York City Suppression of Vice Police Squad, and 9 men, along with the manager on duty, were arrested and fined for, quote, lewd acts. Which, 1920s term for they were having...
Intercourse. Or other things.
Now, a second raid would be conducted in 1920, and 15 more men would be arrested and fined for lewd acts. Throughout the 20s, the Everard continued to grow in popularity amongst a secret society of homosexuals to the point that it was becoming famous even in Europe, as in 1927, a famous British actor and playwright named Emmeline Williams stated that he had heard about the Everard from a French friend who stated, quote, London has nothing on what you can experience here. Again, only one serious incident was known to have occurred during this time, when on September 24th, 1927, a prominent newspaper writer named Frank O'Connor was beaten to death inside the baths by a trio of men, including a famous boxer named Frankie Fay. No motive was ever established. Now, by the 1930s, the baths had become known as the central hub for New York's queer scene and was said to be, quote, the safest, classiest, most private, and most well-known of the baths. The Everard was so popular that eventually it earned the nickname Everhard by the New York queer community as a sort of inside joke. Multiple celebrities were known to frequent the baths during this time, including Truman Capote. I'm sorry if I butcher some of these names. Some of them are very famous, like European. Rudolph Nureyev, Alfred Lunt, Clifton Webb, Gore Vidal, who in 1950 actually wrote a book under the pen name Catherine Everard as an inside joke for those familiar with the bathhouse. And probably the most random celebrity to ever visit the baths was Alfred Hitchcock. No, and they were like, no, he wasn't. Don't get the idea. He would come, sit in a towel, watch everybody, and then leave. And I was reading an interview, these are their words, not mine. Someone goes, yeah, we all just wondered who the fat guy was just sitting there watching us. And then they're like, that's Alfred Hitchcock. So just to show you how well-known these baths are, even the great Alfred Hitchcock was like, I want to go see what all the fuss is about. I just want to watch. Now, throughout the 30s and through McCarthyism during the 1950s, the baths remained one of the only true safe havens for homosexuals. You know, we talked about like 1950s was one of the worst times in America to be gay. The Lavender Scare, McCarthyism, it was horrible. Gay bars operated in secret during this time, but were under constant threat of being raided and patrons being harassed. The Baths were in a discreet, unmarked building and provided private rooms, dimly lit showers, and other areas that gave men the ability to take greater risks when engaging in homosexual activity, compared to a crowded bar.
Or the park.
Or
an alley.
Or a bathroom. Now, eventually it got to the point, however, that the Baths were so popular that the Everard's clientele was now known to be exclusively gay men. As we entered the 1960s, gay bars and homosexuality still remained very much illegal, and concerns were starting to get raised about what to do with areas like the Baths, as although being gay was illegal, it was a very lucrative business and was drawing in large amounts of money. So the Baths were allowed to continue to operate fairly in the open as they drew in big money, and by the time Stonewall happened in 1969 and officially kicked off the modern-day gay liberation movement, the open secret was now fully out of the closet. People saw how lucrative the Baths were, and pretty soon dozens were opening up all over the city, with the most popular being the Continental, which I'm sure some of our listeners have heard of the Continental. The Continental was created as a direct result of the owner, Steve Astro, witnessing the crowds that flocked to the Everard every night and his desire to create a more welcoming and queer-friendly place, as he described the Everard as, quote, sleazy, secretive, unkempt, not to mention unfriendly. And sadly, he was kind of right. Despite the fact that gay men were now allowed to be more open at the Baths and at the bars, by the 1970s, the Everard had become infamous, not because of its catering to homosexuals, but due to the horrendous squalor and condition of the Baths. Bruce Voller, the director of the Gay Task Force, publicly states, quote, as a shabby, dreadful place, run down and grubby beyond words, it's only still popular due to the safety of the general area.
I mean, if it's making money, why wouldn't they keep it up?
That is one thing a lot of people question. I'll mention it here in a little bit, but it's one of those things where it's like, that costs money, and if people are still coming here, regardless of if it's a shithole, why should I bother keeping it upkept? One review of the Baths from Gay Magazine in 1972 described it as, quote, a moldy domain in a Transylvanian crypt. That's how you know it's pretty bad, when someone literally describes your establishment as a Transylvanian crypt. Playwright Larry Kramer described it as, quote, hideous, like Kafka. There were wire mesh walls, and the floors were filthy and stank. The Everard had long fallen from grace and was no longer the lavish and luxurious Baths of yesteryear. But despite the very well-known disgusting conditions of the Baths, they continued to prove to be extremely popular, and the current owner at the time had no plans or desire to do anything to make it better. The owner throughout the 60s and into the 70s was a 62-year-old man named Irving Fine. Now, Irving had made his money in the garment-making industry, but was heavily believed to have had mob ties and been involved with the mafia, which also checks out, as we have also mentioned several times on this podcast. The vast majority of gay establishments in New York throughout the 60s and 70s were owned by the mafia. And it's always such a fascinating thing. It's not like the mafia is like these big queer heroes here.
They just see the money in it.
They see the money, and that's one of the most fascinating things, though, is that if it wasn't for the mafia, the queer scene community today would look a lot different, because the only reason the gay bars that were allowed to operate in the 50s and 60s was because they were owned by the mafia, who could pay off the police to turn a blind eye. So fascinating, like the little connections between all these things. And it's like, if it wasn't for the mafia, we may not have a queer community today. Now, Irvin made it pretty clear he was only operating the Baths for the money and didn't care how disgusting they got as long as people continued to come and visit. This was also during a time that, although queer people were enjoying a much larger scale of freedom compared to years past, it was still illegal to be gay. But now law enforcement were adopting a more don't ask, don't tell policy towards homosexuality, meaning as long as you're not out parading in the street constantly, you can exist behind closed doors at bars and Baths and not have to worry about constant raids. although those still continue to happen today, actually. But a downside to that was that they also weren't policing or enforcing queer establishments to be up to code in terms of safety and sanitation, and this caused many spaces to fall into disrepair, which we also talked about, like the Stonewall. Stonewall is one of the most iconic, well-known, infamous events in history, and so I think it's easy for people to get this idea of what the actual bar Stonewall was like. It was horrible. It had no electricity, no running water. There was flooded, there was water on the floor. It was disgusting. And the same can be said for the Everard. These obvious violations of health codes would result in a massive fire breaking out in 1973, 4 years before the Everard tragedy. Now, during this incident, the tight, poorly ventilated corridors of the upper floors of the baths were converted into 135 cubicles built out of flimsy plywood and fencing and rented out to men for $7.
Just little sex coves.
Literally little sex coves. And they just stuck plywood and put wire mesh around them like a chicken coop. Now, of course, one major draw of the baths was the large amount of sexual encounters that could occur there. And one of the most popular items you'll find in areas like that where large groups of men will gather to have sex. One very popular item that is still used today.
Lubricant?
Yeah, besides lubricant, actually, I should specify. Something that's used a lot. And it's called amyl nitrate, a.k.a. poppers.
I thought poppers, but then I was like, I always thought poppers was like VCR cleaner.
I literally just put in here, I said, a.k.a. poppers, a.k.a. VCR cleaner.
But I'm like, there wasn't VCRs at this time.
I think it was made specifically, the current version is for VCR cleaners, but I think it did exist before that because there was records of it in the 20s. I just think it was used for something else.
Oh, you learn something new. Like I said, learn something new every episode.
And yeah, you learn poppers have been around forever.
Before VCRs.
Before VCRs. Now, poppers is something that you sniff, and it helps relax the muscles in various areas of your body to make sex more pleasurable. But also, and I'm not sure how many people actually know this, so also another fun fact, it is also, not fun fact, but a very important fact to know, it is also highly flammable. According to later reports, the amount of poppers used on the upper floor of the baths was so great that a large gas cloud had begun to form and build up in the space. And one evening, as a man walked down the tight hallway on the 3rd floor while sniffing poppers, another man coming the opposite direction began to light up a cigarette. And unfortunately, the two would bump into each other and a fire would break out. The fire quickly ripped through the cheap plywood holding the cubicles together before completely devouring the 3rd floor and making its way down to the 2nd. Eventually, firefighters were able to put the blaze out, and by some miracle, no one died or was seriously hurt, although the fire completely destroyed the 3rd floor of the baths. A later investigation by the city would find that the sprinklers inside of the baths were in fact not working and had not been working for over 10 years. Irving was told that he would have to install new ones, and he agreed he would once the 3rd floor was rebuilt. But sadly, he would never keep that promise, and no one from the city would check back in to make sure he did, resulting in there being no sprinklers or fire alarms the day the Everard would burst into flames and take so many lives. But that's not all. Because after the Everard fire of 1977, it was discovered that the last time the building was inspected and brought up to health code standards, guess the year of the last health code inspector.
Probably back in the 1950s?
The Everard Baths was last inspected and brought up to health code in 1921.
Oh, wow.
Over 50 years. No one's bothered to check to make sure everything's running smoothly in this very tightly, very popular establishment.
I said the 50s because I figured back in the 50s it still wasn't all gay, wasn't it? Or did it happen? I figured they probably stopped checking it once it was mainly gay people in there because Who gives a shit about gay people?
But also I think it's, it's something that even is still true today. If you can cut corners, they're going to cut corners. So they're like, if they're not asking us, we're not going to bring it up. Now, since that time, no one from the city bothered to go and check to make sure the building was actually safe to have people inside, despite it being one of the most popular places in the entire city. On top of that, having no sprinklers, the Baths had no emergency exits, no emergency lights, bars on the windows to prevent them from being broken, and due to the owners never cleaning the building, trash and other flammable material was just allowed to pile up in the already very tight corridors of the Baths. So it was literally a disaster waiting to happen. No emergency exits, no backup lights, bars over the windows to keep people from jumping out, and trash everywhere.
That also shows you just how bad people had it to try to go and find a place to have sex. If they're going to use this place that sounds disgusting, that just shows you how desperate they really were. Because outside of this, they could be arrested.
Mm-hmm.
They could be exposed. So just for the safety of having privacy to do what you wanted to do, you're willing to do it in squalor.
And that's the thing. Also, survivors actually talk about that. And it's what other options do we have? And it's kind of stuck in a rock between a hard place. It's we can't complain to the city because the city doesn't care. They're you're lucky we let you do it at all.
If you went and complained to the city, they would be oh, you're a homosexual going into this business. Let's arrest you for homosexuality.
But then also you could potentially get that place shut down, and then you lose one of the only safe places to hook up. So it is such a tragic thing where it's they had no other option than to deal with this squalor.
It just shows you the desperation of all of it. It's really sad.
It is very sad. It shows you and I think we kind of we still have a lot of struggles and a lot of things we have to work through for the queer community in 2024. But I think one of the things that I think we lose appreciation for is the fact that most of our gay bars and establishments aren't literal death trap and squalor. You don't have to go to a place that is mold infested, a fire could start any minute, just to be with another man.
Just to be gay there.
Just to be gay there. So, again, this was just a recipe for disaster waiting to happen, and sadly, on May 25th, 1977, it finally did. No official cause for the fire could ever be 100% established. However, it was eventually decided that the burning mattress Miguel had seen was the primary source. The mattress had actually caught on fire earlier in the night after a patron dropped his lit cigarette onto it. However, it was quickly extinguished and forgotten about. So investigators believe that the fire may actually have reignited after smoldering for a few hours.
At least it wasn't a hate crime. I figured going into this, somebody said it intentionally.
Well,
we'll
get to that. There's a lot of mystery surrounding why the fire actually happened. Either way, by 7:40 in the morning, the entire upper 3 floors of the building were on fire and crumbling under the heat because the building was so decrepit that the walls and the ceilings were literally crashing down. Chaos erupted between 80 and 100 men as they scrambled around in the pitch dark and thick smoke trying to find an exit. Firefighters arrived to the scene almost immediately to find that multiple men had already begun flinging themselves out of the upper windows to escape the fire. Dozens of men in various states of undress, many nude or only wearing a bath towel, stood in the street covered in soot and being treated for minor burns and smoke inhalation. It would take over 200 firefighters over 2 hours to get the fire under control. Attempts to reach the fire and the people still trapped on the inside were hindered by the fact that most of the windows were barricaded with metal bars blocking anything from getting in or out. The firefighters who did go in found it near impossible to navigate due to the smoke, and on top of that, the roof of the baths and the floors were already collapsing and blocking any entrances. By 10:40 in the morning, 3 hours after the fire had begun, the last person was evacuated from the baths as everyone stood out on the street watching the once legendary establishment crumble into ash. Now, despite 100 men being trapped inside when the initial fire broke out, miraculously, the majority of them escaped without serious injury and survived. Sadly, 9 men would lose their lives in the fire, with many being burned beyond recognition. A later firefighter would state that the majority of the men died after the roof collapsed, blocking them from getting to an exit in time. They ranged in age from just 17 all the way to 40. Later autopsies would reveal that 7 died from smoke inhalation, 1 died after jumping from the 3rd floor, and 1 died later on at the hospital from respiratory burns. The bodies were lined up on the street as other guests attempted to help officers identify any of the dead, and at the time, only 1 victim was able to be identified as a man named Ira Landau. He was only able to be identified because his boyfriend of 6 years had heard about the fire and rushed over to see what was going on, and he noticed that one of the burned corpses was wearing a ring he had given Ira. Now, as if the tragedy of the fire itself wasn't enough, in the coming days, things would only get worse for the survivors and the queer community as news spread of what had happened at the Everard Baths. By dawn the next morning, a story was printed on the front page of New York Times with the headline reading, quote, "A Hidden World at the Baths," which not only detailed the fire, but also the history and what exactly gay bathhouses were, along with the names of several survivors. So that's another thing too. It's unwanted attention. Like now, this is kind of like a open secret, but still not a lot of the general public know about it. And now on top of this horrific tragedy,
They outed these people.
multiple people lost their lives. Now they're outing people, and now they're drawing all this attention to these bathhouses. And they're like, look, there are establishments right next to your house where all these men meet to have anonymous gay sex.
Yeah, it's nothing about victims in a fire. It's about a den of sin right in your own neighborhood.
And that's the main focus of their stories. The unwanted attention of the outside world descended on the underground culture of queer bathhouses and gay bars once again, as many began to put the blame on the victims themselves for choosing to frequent such sleazy and poorly ran establishments. And again, so it's like, oh, well, of course it was going to cause a fire. What did they expect, having to frequent all these horribly ran, poorly conditioned buildings? Like, why would you go there in the first place? Now, one survivor of the fire, a married doctor with 3 kids, actually outed himself in order to give a statement addressing people trying to blame the victims, where he stated, quote, "I was willing to put up with a lot in the way of dirt and mattress fires, as everyone thought it was one of the only places that wouldn't get raided. Gay men are not given a lot of options in the types of establishments they are allowed to openly frequent." On top of the reaction to the fire from the general public, the queer community was outraged and wanted answers from the mayor and city officials about how such a tragedy would be allowed to happen. Now, the NYC mayor at the time, Abe Beame, would hold a press conference the day after the fire in which he stated that Irving Fine was told he would need to install sprinklers within the year, and that other than that, there was nothing they could do. And this would be the only time the fire was addressed by anyone outside of the queer community itself. So again, they kind of brushed it under the rug, like, we did what we had to do, our hands are tied, RIP. Moving on. So there was never an official investigation into the cause of the fire. Investigators took survivor statements and went off Miguel's, figuring that his answer was good enough, and called it a day. So they never actually investigated it. They interviewed the survivors, and they're like, that makes sense. So we're going with that.
Place is sleazy. Somebody accidentally set a mattress on fire with a cigarette. It happens. It's logical.
So they're like, all right, case closed. But many believe that it was more than possible that the fire could have been started intentionally, especially when you consider the owner's shady business dealings. Irving Fine was believed to have mob connections, and he was known to be in debt at the time of the fire, and that after the fire, he received a sizable payout from the insurance company. So, allegedly, again, there was never an investigation, so we don't know 100% for a fact, but many people were outraged that there wasn't an investigation to actually definitively prove that it was an accident. It could very well have just been a horrible accident. But at the same time, they're like, You only know that if you actually investigate, because also there's at least one other major person that has motive to set this place on fire outside of people just wanting to burn it down because it's a gay establishment. So despite these concerns, the case was closed and to this day is officially listed as an accident. The fire dealt a huge blow to the growing queer community of New York, and many sought to rally behind the tragedy and use it to bring awareness to the gay liberation movement and the lives lost that day. To start, none of the victims who died that day at the Everard were identified or claimed by their families, and instead many were identified through friends, as many of the victims had been disowned for being gay. The Metropolitan Community Church began to raise money for the funeral cost, something they had also helped do just 4 years earlier with the upstairs lounge fire victims, which the Metropolitan Community Church is like the gay church, first of its kind that popped up in the early 1970s. And they also worked with queer leaders to host a blood drive for the survivors. Because remember, this is pre-AIDS, so gay people were still allowed to donate. Protests were also held with queer people demanding that the building be brought up to code to prevent such a tragedy from happening again. Fundraisers were held as the community rallied together to make sure the victims were given proper burials, as none were claimed by families, and all of them were at risk of being buried in unmarked graves. Gay bars in the city began hosting fundraising nights, including one at the time, a newly opened gay bar called The Mine Shaft. You also may have heard of it. And with their help, all the victims were given a proper burial. Activists also took out stories in the New York Times where they reminded the general public that this was much more than just a gay issue. This was an issue of coming together as a city to comfort and take care of their own in the face of a very preventable tragedy. Irving Fine rebuilt the Baths, and within a year, he reopened the Everard to the public as the tragedy was starting to quickly be forgotten about almost as quickly as it occurred. So within a year of this happening, Baths were back. They acted like nothing happened. So the Everard Baths actually continued to remain open and operate almost for another decade before finally being shut down permanently in 1986 by New York City Mayor Ed Koch in his campaign to shut down major queer establishments in the city in an attempt to stop the spread of HIV during the height of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. As of 2024, the space that once housed the Everard Baths is now home to a food manufacturing company with no visible signs left of the vibrant history that once resided there. The Everard was forgotten about for close to 40 years, but thankfully has seen a newfound resurgence in recent years as people are remembering the good and the bad parts it held for so many gay men. You know, I think it's more important now than ever to talk about those spaces that once held so much meaning to the queer community, like the Everard Baths or the gay bars of yesteryear, because they are sadly going extinct in a time of the internet and Grindr. And it's one of those things, it's like, you know, they may hold less importance to the current generation of queer people. Especially to me, it's so fascinating to think of how much meaning and symbolism and how influential just gay bars and gay bathhouses were back then, because they were the only places you could meet other queer people, you know, rally together, found families, start uprisings. And so they are a very important part of queer culture that definitely still need to be remembered. Now, Gregor Mattson, author of the 2023 book, Who Needs Gay Bars? Bar Hopping Through America's Endangered LGBTQ plus Spaces, said it best, quote, "Places that were relatively private, gay bars with back rooms, bathhouses, public cruising spots, were important and still are. Because as gay men, we don't have a lot of models for what sex can be or what intimacy looks like. Queer people deserve choices, and the Everard provided that for many during its time." Now, the victims of the Everard fire were as followed: Jimmy Stewart, 30 years old, Brian Duffy, 30 years old, Patrick Nolt, 27, Hillman Adams, 40, Alamo Armando, 17, Joseph Sinonic, 30, Kenneth Hall, 38, Ira Landau, 32, and Anthony Clerco, 25. and that is the history and the tragedy of the Everard Baths of New York City. A lot more of a queer history episode here, but I love bringing you guys that type of information because it's fascinating to me. And the fact that you can remember long forgotten pieces of queer history. Because like I said, it's one of those things. It's like the Everard Baths, the mine shaft, all these places that were so famous. Like, I don't think we can comprehend how famous these spaces were. And now no one really talks about them. They're really slowly being forgotten to time. And so I think it's really important to remember our history as queer people and to be a source to provide that information to people who may not know about it.
And I mean, really, this is still a true crime episode because that person that owned it let the place become so derelict and actually didn't do all of the stuff that he was supposed to have it as a legal functioning establishment. So, I mean, history, but yeah, it's still a crime because this person, it was so preventable.
I will say also, technically every case we cover, even if it's more of a queer history episode, is still true crime because for 99% of human history, just being gay was a crime.
True.
So it may not be a murder all the time, but this is a queer podcast. We cover a lot of historical cases, which means it is true crime because you're committing a crime, quote unquote, for just being queer. So yes, still falls in the realm of true crime. But yes, it's very sad, very fascinating case to read about because, like I said, it doesn't get talked about a lot anymore. And so I love the fact that we are able to at least make some of you aware of this event, this tragedy, and this colorful and rich history of one of the most iconic and infamous spaces in queer history.
And I know a lot of people today that would love if there was still bathhouses around.
We are actually getting a bathhouse where we live. It's not a gay bathhouse, but it's like a sauna bathhouse. Really random, but we'll see how that goes.
Figuring it's going to be run out of the city really quickly if any gay people show up for it.
And that's not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying if you build it, they will come. And with that, thank you guys so much again for tuning in for another episode. If you want to see photos from this case, you can follow us on Instagram at Beers with Queers Pod or on Facebook at Beers with Queers, a true crime podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, you can leave us a 5-star rating or review on iTunes or Spotify. Helps us out a lot. Helps other people discover the podcast. And of course, we just love hearing from you guys. And we will see you guys back in 2025 because this is the last episode of 2024.
For real.
So hopefully you guys have a safe and wonderful new year, and we will see you in January. Stay dangerous out there, my friend.
See you next year.